The other woman's shoes were still beside the bed. Lena Voss noticed them the moment she opened the door to the royal bedchamber. Two ivory heels, narrow and expensive, placed with the particular tidiness of someone who had expected to leave at a reasonable hour and had not. One of them sat at an angle against the carved leg of the nightstand. The other had been knocked beneath the velvet footstool. A silver evening wrap hung over the back of the chair where Lena's own robe usually waited. She stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. Her hands held a breakfast tray she had carried herself from the kitchens because the head housekeeper was running a fever, and Lena had not wanted to wake anyone at 6:30 in the morning. The tray held 2 cups. She had not known yet that she would only need one. Aldrich was not in the room. The bed had been slept in, or not slept in exactly, the sheets pulled loose from 2 sides, a pillow on the floor, the heavy coverlet shoved toward the foot. The fireplace had burned down to ash. On the mantelpiece, beside the silver clock and the small framed portrait of their daughter, sat a half-empty wine glass with a rim of pale lipstick along the edge. Not Lena's shade. Lena wore nothing on her lips before noon. She always had. Aldrich had teased her about it once, years ago, in a different version of this marriage. She thought about the summit dinner the previous evening, which she had attended for its first hour before leaving because Myra had developed a cough, and Lena had not trusted the night nurse to calibrate the steam tent correctly. She had kissed Aldrich's cheek at the entrance to the banquet hall. His hands had been in his pockets in the particular way they were when he was managing something he did not want her to see in his face. She had noticed this and filed it in the column she had been filling quietly for 4 months. Things that had not added up individually, but were adding up collectively. 4 months of late returns from meetings. 4 months of the particular quality of silence when she asked how the summit preparations were going. Not hostile silence, not evasive exactly, simply the silence of a man whose answer and his actual thoughts were no longer the same thing. She had been a territorial claims analyst for 3 years before their marriage. She had learned to read the gap between a documented claim and the physical evidence on the ground. She had learned that the gap was where the truth lived. The gap had been widening since summer. She had told herself, on each of the approximately 60 occasions she had noticed it widening, that she could be wrong. That exhaustion read like distance. That the weight of a difficult political season could make anyone harder to reach. These explanations had been available and she had used them, because they were available, and because she had wanted them to be true, and because the alternative required her to begin a reckoning she did not yet have the information to complete. She had the information now. Lena set the tray on the table beside the door. She did not touch the wine glass or the shoes or the wrap. She stood in the center of the room and looked at each object once, carefully, the way she had learned to look at evidence during the 3 years she had worked as a territorial claims analyst before marrying the Alpha King. She had been very good at that work. She had understood, then, that the hardest thing about an accurate assessment was not gathering information, but surviving the moment when all the information arranged itself into a shape you had already suspected and had been hoping was wrong. The shape was no longer uncertain. She heard him in the corridor outside the east sitting room. His voice carried the particular quiet he used after difficult nights, low and deliberate, the voice of a man managing his own exhaustion before anyone could see it. She could hear a second voice, too, a woman's, soft and brief. Then a door, the soft click of a latch being pulled closed. Aldrich came through the bedchamber's side entrance a minute later. He stopped when he saw her. He was still in last night's formal clothes, collar open, jacket over one arm. He looked tired. He also looked, for a fraction of a second, like a man calculating distance. "Elena," he said. She did not answer immediately. She looked at him the same way she had looked at the room, carefully, once. "You should have told me yourself," she said, "before tonight became something I found instead of something you explained." His jaw tightened. "Nothing happened that you need to." She raised one hand and he stopped. "I am not asking you to defend it," Lena said. "I am telling you that I found it. Those are different things." She picked up the breakfast tray. One cup had already gone lukewarm. She set it back down. "And I carried this up myself because Hannah is sick and I didn't want to call anyone at 6 in the morning, which is the kind of thing I do, Aldrich, routinely, without telling you, because I assumed you were alone." He looked at the tray. Something moved behind his eyes. "Who is she?" Lena said. Not a question, a boundary. "She deserves a name since she is apparently leaving her shoes in my bedroom." His expression changed again. She recognized the shift. He was deciding how much truth was safe. "Her name is Vera," he said. "She's been in the capital for 2 weeks. She was at the summit dinner last night." Lena remembered the summit dinner. She had attended the first hour of it before leaving because their daughter Myra had developed a cough, and Lena had not trusted the night nurse to calibrate the steam tent correctly. She had kissed Aldrich's cheek before leaving. He had told her he'd follow in an hour. He had not followed in an hour. She said nothing for a moment. Outside the tall windows of the royal suite, the capital was beginning to wake. She could hear the first bells from the market district, distant and ordinary. "How long?" she said. Aldrich was quiet. "It does not have to be precise," Lena said, roughly. 4 months." She absorbed this with the same outward stillness she used in claims assessments when a document contradicted 3 others, and she needed a moment before speaking. The stillness was not calm. It was precision. It was the particular discipline of a woman who had learned, very young, that anger shown in the wrong moment cost you more than the person you were angry at. 4 months, she said again, "and you intended to tell me when." He looked toward the window. The gesture told her more than the silence that followed it. Lena walked to the wardrobe. She removed a travel bag from the top shelf, the smaller one, the one she used for overnight stays when she accompanied him to boarder meetings. She set it on the bed. "What are you doing?" Aldrich said. And for the first time since he had entered the room, she heard something in his voice that was not calculation. She folded 2 blouses and placed them in the bag. "I am going to my sister's house," she said, "with Myra, for a few days." "Elena." She looked at him, not with the analysis she had been using for the past 10 minutes, but directly. As herself. "You had 4 months to tell me," she said. "You chose not to. That means this morning is not a mistake I interrupted. It is a decision you have been maintaining. And I cannot stay in this room while I decide what that means for the rest of my life." He did not reach for her. She did not wait for him to. She packed efficiently, the way she did everything. 2 changes of clothes for herself, Myra's favorite sweater, the small medical kit she always brought when Myra's cough was acting up. She moved through the dressing room and into the nursery that adjoined the royal suite, where Myra was still asleep, one arm thrown over her stuffed brown wolf, her dark hair spread across the pillow in the sprawling, boneless way children only sleep when the world has not yet given them reason to curl inward. Lena sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. Myra stirred. "Mama." "We're going to Aunt Kira's today," Lena said, "for a little while." Myra blinked. Is Papa coming? Not today, sweetheart, just us. Myra considered this with 3-year-old seriousness. She accepted it the way small children accept things that come from their mothers with calm certainty. Okay, she said, and held up her wolf. He has to come too. Of course he does, Lena said. She dressed Myra and packed the wolf and carried the bags to the carriage herself before informing Aldrich's senior aide, not Aldrich, that she would be at her sister's residence for the remainder of the week and that all of Myra's scheduled appointments should be redirected there. She kept her voice even. The aide, who had worked in the royal household for 11 years and understood precisely what this kind of request at this kind of hour meant, wrote everything down without asking a single question. Aldrich was waiting in the entrance hall when she came back for Myra. "You don't have to do this tonight," he said. "Let me explain properly." "It is morning," Lena said, "and I don't need an explanation. I need distance." She picked up Myra, who was examining the carved stone wolves above the entrance arch with great attention. "Mama, that one looks like he's growling." "He probably is," Lena said. "Sometimes wolves do that when they're frightened." She carried her daughter out through the palace doors and did not look back at the man standing in the entrance hall, who was watching her go with an expression she would have been very interested in during a different version of this morning. Kira met them at the door of her townhouse with the particular brisk warmth of a woman who had learned, over many years of being Lena's sister, not to ask questions when Lena arrived with a bag and a child and eyes that were absolutely, deliberately dry. She made tea. She put Myra in the guest room with a bowl of porridge and a picture book about a traveling wolf who maps the mountains. She sat across from Lena at the kitchen table. "Tell me," she said. Lena told her. She did not cry while she told her. She had discovered, at some point in the past 2 hours, that the grief she expected had not arrived yet. In its place was something sharper and cleaner, a kind of absolute clarity she recognized from the moments in her analytical work when a complex case suddenly arranged itself into its correct shape and there was nothing left to argue about. 4 months, Kira said when she finished. At least, Lena said. Kira pressed her lips together. She was 5 years older than Lena and had never particularly liked Aldrich, which she had managed to keep to herself for 6 years of Lena's marriage with an effort Lena had always silently appreciated. "What are you going to do?" Lena wrapped both hands around her tea. "I don't know yet." She looked at the steam rising from the cup. "I know what I am not going to do. I am not going to go back tonight and accept an apology that will prevent him from understanding the weight of this. And I am not going to decide anything permanent while I am still in the part of this where everything is very loud inside my head." "That is sensible," Kira said. "I know it is," Lena said. "I was always sensible. It turns out that has not protected me from anything." 3 days passed at Kira's house. Myra's cough improved. Lena slept more than she expected to. She worked from the guest room each morning on the territorial water rights analysis her office had been compiling for 2 months, finding, as she usually did, that the precision required by the work steadied her in ways that rest alone could not. She answered her correspondence and declined, quietly and without explanation, 2 requests from Aldrich's private secretary that she returned to the palace for scheduled joint appearances. On the 4th morning, Aldrich himself arrived at Kira's door. Kira let him in with the expression of a woman performing a professional duty she found personally distasteful. He sat across from Lena at the same kitchen table where she had told her sister everything, 3 days prior, and he looked worse than he had looked on the morning she had left, which she found, privately, both accurate and insufficient. He had prepared things to say. She could tell. He had the careful posture of a man who had rehearsed. "I ended it," he said. Lena looked at him. "When?" "The morning you left." She calculated this without letting the calculation show in her face. That meant he had ended it within hours of her leaving. That fact was relevant. She filed it. "Why?" she said. He looked startled. "I ended it because it was wrong. Because I watched you carry that tray into the room by yourself, and I understood, in a way I had apparently not allowed myself to understand before, what I had been doing." She nodded once. "What had you been doing?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet, she recognized, that was not evasion but something the person actually needed. Being willing, he said, to let something exist that I had told myself was separate from my real life. As if a thing that exists in the same building where my daughter sleeps can be separate from anything that matters. Lena let that sit in the room for a moment. "I have spent 4 months telling myself it wasn't serious enough to confess and not casual enough to simply stop," he said. "I was wrong about both." She looked at her tea. "I know you were." He waited. "I have not decided anything permanent," she said. "I want to be clear about that before you say anything that requires a response about the future. I have not decided whether this marriage continues. I have not decided whether it ends. I have decided that I am not going back to the palace tomorrow." He looked at her. "I am not going back until I am certain I am going back because I want to be there," Lena said. "Not because leaving has become inconvenient, or because Myra needs her routine, or because the court is asking questions. Those are real considerations. They are not the deciding consideration." "What is?" Aldrich said. "Whether I believe," she said, "that you understand the difference between what you interrupted when you chose this and what you were actually risking. Because I don't think you did understand it. I think you understood it abstractly. I think on the morning I found those shoes you understood it completely for possibly the first time. And I think that gap between abstract and complete is very significant, and I need to know which side of it you intend to live on from here." He was quiet for a long time. "The complete side," he said. He said it without the precision of a rehearsed answer. He said it the way he used to say things when they had first met, when he had not yet learned to manage what he showed her. She looked at him directly. "That is the only answer I would have considered." She did not go back that day. She went back 12 days later, having spent that time at Kira's house completing the water rights analysis, taking Myra to the park twice, sleeping reasonably well, and having one long conversation with a counselor who had worked with the palace's health office for many years and who had, with admirable professionalism, not mentioned whose wife she was. She returned on a Tuesday morning, with Myra on her hip and her bag in one hand and the completed territorial analysis under her arm. Aldrich met her in the entrance hall. He took the bag without being asked. He did not reach for Myra until Myra reached for him, which Lena noticed and noted. The shoes were gone from the bedchamber. The wine glass was gone. The silver wrap was gone. The room smelled of cedar and clean linen. She did not comment on any of it. She set the analysis on the desk and unpacked her bag while Myra told Aldrich about the park and the pigeons and the incident with the bread roll that had lasted 15 minutes in the telling and involved 3 pigeons and what Myra described with great gravity as a conspiracy. That evening, after Myra was in bed, They sat in the sitting room off the bedroom with tea, and the quiet that had always come easily between them and had, she suspected, been one of the things he had tried to replicate with someone else, and had found, as people often did, that it was not a thing that replicated. She did not forgive him that night. Forgiveness was a slower process than she believed people gave it credit for, a real one rather than a declared one, and she was interested in doing it correctly if she was going to do it at all. She said, instead, "I am going to tell you the thing you should understand clearly about what these 12 days have been." He looked at her. "I did not spend them missing you," she said. "I spent them deciding whether the life I have built matters enough to me to do the work of rebuilding the part of it that you damaged. And what I found, sitting at Kira's kitchen table every morning with my work and my daughter and a cup of tea that was not as good as the one I make here, is that the answer is yes. Not because this is easy, not because I am not angry, but because the thing I have built is real and real things are worth the work." He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the one he wore at border meetings when a negotiation had gone better than expected, and he was deciding whether to acknowledge it. "I know," he said. "I have been sitting in this suite for 12 days understanding how close I came to being the man who threw something real away because he had convinced himself it was indestructible." She nodded. "Don't," she said, "next time." "There will not be a next time." "I know there will not," she said. "If I did not believe that I would not be sitting here." They were quiet for a while. Outside, the city moved in its nighttime rhythms, carriages and bells and the distant voices of people who were not managing the careful, difficult work of putting something important back together. "This is not the easy version," Lena said after a while. "No," Aldrich agreed. "The easy version was the one where I cried in that doorway, and you promised it would never happen again, and I believed you because it was easier than the alternative." His face was very still. "This version requires you to actually change rather than simply apologize well," she said. "And it requires me to actually decide rather than simply stay. Those are harder things." She looked at him, "But they are the real things." He reached across and covered her hand with his. She did not pull away. She also did not interlock her fingers with his, not yet. There was a difference, and he seemed to understand it because he simply kept his hand over hers and said nothing, and she found, sitting there in the quiet sitting room with the tea cooling and the city outside and her daughter asleep in the nursery down the hall, that the quiet between them was still one of the real things. Damaged, but present. Still accurate, even if no longer easy. She would decide, over the following months, that she was glad she had not chosen the easy version. Not because the hard version was without pain, it had considerable pain, but because the things that came from it, the honesty, the slower and truer rebuilding, the version of her husband she encountered on the other side of the reckoning, were more real than anything the easy version would have preserved. Myra, 3 years old and entirely uninterested in the complicated architecture of adult decisions, continued to bring her stuffed wolf to breakfast every morning, arrange him carefully beside her bowl, and inform him of the day's events with the complete confidence of someone who believes the most important listener in the room is always the one who loves you most. Lena watched her do this sometimes and thought that her daughter was, in this particular matter, entirely correct. If you stayed through all of it, thank you. What Lena carried through those 12 days was not hatred for Aldrich or even rage, though rage would have been justified. It was the harder thing. The decision to remain a full person rather than a collection of reactions to someone else's choices. You cannot control who betrays you. You can control what you decide your life is worth. If that spoke to you, leave one word in the comments. Real. And if this story stayed with you, a like, a share, or a subscription helps us bring more of them here. There are more wolves making expensive mistakes, and more women who know their own worth in the quiet way that matters most. The next several days at Kira's house had their own rhythm. Mornings belonged to Myra and the water rights analysis in equal measure. Lena worked at the kitchen table while Myra constructed elaborate arrangements of Kira's spice jars along the windowsill and narrated their interactions to the stuffed wolf, who was apparently involved in some kind of governance dispute that updated daily. Lena listened with half her attention and gave the other half to the territorial boundary maps, and found that this division, which might have seemed insufficient in another circumstance, was precisely what she had energy for. Kira brought her tea without asking and left her alone with it when it was clear the tea was not what she needed, but the not tasking was. On the second evening, Myra fell asleep on the sitting room sofa at 7 o'clock, with her face pressed against the wolf's ear and one small hand still holding a biscuit she had not finished. Lena carried her to the guest bed and sat for a moment on the edge of it in the dark room, listening to the deep, even rhythm of her daughter's breathing. She had told herself, on the carriage ride to Kira's house, that she would not cry until Myra was asleep. She cried quietly for about 6 minutes. Then she washed her face and went back to the kitchen table and worked until midnight on a subsection of the analysis involving competing historical claims to the Ardenmere watershed, which required her to hold 3 separate legal frameworks in her head simultaneously and left no room for anything else, which was precisely why she kept working. Kira found her there at midnight and placed a bowl of soup beside the maps, without speaking, and sat across from her with her own tea. "He's going to come," Kira said. "I know," Lena said. "What will you say?" "I don't know yet." She looked up from the maps. "I know what I will not say." Kira waited. "I will not say it's fine," Lena said. "I will not say I understand. I will not offer him the exit that makes this easier for him than it should be. Those are the versions of this conversation that feel generous but actually teach the wrong thing." "He knows you," Kira said. "He knows you well enough to know that you don't say it's fine when it isn't." "Knowing me well enough is different from having honored that knowledge consistently for the past 4 months, Lena said. Kira picked up her tea. "That is a very precise distinction." "I am a very precise person." Lena looked back at the watershed maps. "It has not served me as well as I had hoped." The third morning, a letter arrived from the palace. Not from Aldrich directly, but from his private secretary, formally requesting her availability for 3 upcoming joint appearances over the following fortnight, including a territorial council dinner and the mid-autumn charity presentation she had organized herself, months earlier, before any of this had existed as a fact she needed to manage. She read the letter twice. She wrote back in the same formal register, declining all 3 engagements for the current week and advising that her office would be in touch regarding rescheduling. She signed it with her full name and title. She sent it with Kira's household courier. She did not feel guilty about the charity presentation. She had built the organization of it well enough that her absence from a single event would not damage it. She had always built things well enough that her absence did not damage them. This, she understood now, had made it easy for Aldrich to believe her presence was optional rather than chosen. She had been choosing every day to be present. The choosing had been invisible. She was going to need, going forward, to make the choosing more visible, which was not the same as making it conditional, but which was also not nothing. She thought about this during the Ardenmere analysis and in the hour before sleep, when her mind, freed from the precision required by the work, moved over the landscape of the past 6 years the way her eyes had moved over that bedchamber, carefully, looking for the truth of the shape. 6 years. She and Aldrich had met at a territorial summit in the southern provinces. She had been presenting the findings of the Crescent water claims analysis, her third independent commission in 2 years, and the one that had established her reputation sufficiently that the summit organizers had asked her to present rather than simply submit. Aldrich had been there as the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, attending in the last year of a long and politically complicated period of establishing his authority after his father's death. He had stayed after the presentation. He had asked her a question about the methodology she had used to weigh competing historical precedents, a genuine question rather than a social one, and she had answered it genuinely, and they had talked for nearly an hour beside the window while the rest of the summit reception moved and glittered around them. He had called the claims office the following week. He had asked for her specifically, in the professional capacity he had made clear was a pretext, and she had agreed to see him in the non-professional capacity he had made equally clear was the actual point. And they had had dinner, and then more dinners, and then 6 months of a careful, serious courtship conducted across the distance between his capital and her office, and then a marriage that had, for the first 3 years, been exactly as real as she had believed it would be. She tried, sitting at Kira's kitchen table with the water rights maps before her, to identify the moment it had changed. She could not locate a single moment. She found instead a slow accumulation of smaller changes, none of which had been decisive alone, the way a shoreline erodes not from a single wave but from the persistent work of water over time. Aldrich's schedule had grown more demanding. Court politics had thickened. Myra had arrived and reorganized both their lives in the fundamental and permanent way that children do. The intimacy that had been built across the deliberate distance of a courtship had become the assumed intimacy of a shared household, which was a different animal and which required different tending, and which they had perhaps tended less carefully than the original because it had seemed, being assumed, to require less attention. She noted all of this without deciding that it excused anything. Understanding the erosion did not restore the shoreline. It only clarified what the rebuilding required. She added 3 more items to the list in the back of the analysis notebook. She did not feel guilty about the charity presentation. She had been choosing every day to be present. The choosing had been invisible. She was going to need, going forward, to make the choosing more visible, which was not the same as making it conditional, but which was also not nothing. She added this thought to a list she had been keeping in the back of her analysis notebook, items that required address regardless of what she ultimately decided about the marriage. The list had 7 entries. Most of them were not about Aldrich. Most of them were about the version of herself she had been offering to the palace, to his court, to the institutional machinery of being a good royal wife, and what she wanted to reclaim from that offering without dismantling anything essential. She was practical about this. The analysis helped. On the 4th morning, Aldrich arrived. He had not sent word ahead. She appreciated that, actually. It meant he had resisted the instinct to prepare her for the conversation, which would also have prepared him for it in ways that might have made the conversation easier than it ought to be. He stood in Kira's entrance hall in plain clothes, not a royal jacket or a formal collar, just the dark coat and wool trousers he wore on his own time. And he looked exactly as bad as 12 days of sleeping alone in the rooms where she was supposed to be had made him look, which was considerably worse than she had expected, and which she found, privately, accurate. Kira showed him into the kitchen with a manner so professionally neutral that Lena made a note to tell her, later, that it had been appreciated. He sat. He had prepared things to say. She could always tell when he had prepared things to say because he sat slightly differently, a fraction more upright, the particular composure of a man who has spent time deciding on the sequence of something. She waited. If he had prepared things, she wanted to hear them without interrupting, because the prepared version was also information. The sequence in which he chose to address things, the places where the preparation ran out and he had to improvise, those were as significant as the content. "I ended it," he said. She responded as she had already decided she would respond, calmly, with the question of timing, and watched him answer it, and absorbed the answer and filed it. Then she said, "I want to hear all of it, not the version you prepared, the actual version." He looked at her. Something shifted in his composure, the fraction of upright that the preparation required releasing. "The actual version," he said, "is that I met Vera at the Eastern Trade Summit in spring. She was there as part of the Farath delegation. She was—" He stopped. "She was easy," he said, which is a terrible reason and also the accurate one. "She was uncomplicated in a way I had told myself I was missing." He looked at the table. "What I was actually missing was the version of this marriage that existed before I became someone who was managing his own life rather than living it." Lena looked at him. "I convinced myself for 4 months that it was not serious enough to confess," he said. "That it was," he paused, contained. "A thing that existed in a separate space from what was real. And then I watched you carry that tray through the door, and I understood that there is no separate space. There is only the house where my daughter is sleeping, and the woman I married, and the thing I had been maintaining in the same building as both of them." She said nothing for a moment. "Did she know about me?" Lena said. "About Myra?" "Yes." She absorbed this. It was worse than not knowing. A complication known and proceeded with anyway was a different category of choice than a complication that had seemed isolated until it did not. She noted this without showing it. "Did she want more than what it was?" Lena asked. He looked at the table again. "I believe she understood it could not be more. Whether she wanted more is not something I asked because I was not prepared to hear the answer." "That is honest," Lena said. He looked up. "I am not telling you it is good," she said. "I am telling you it is honest and that the honesty is noted." She looked at her hands. "You said you understood on the morning I left that you were risking something real. What does that mean to you, specifically, not abstractly?" He thought about it. The preparation had run out. This was the improvised portion. "It means," he said slowly, "that I was sitting in those rooms for 12 days understanding for the first time that you have been actively choosing this marriage, every day, in ways I was not seeing because I had begun to treat the choosing as automatic. As though the work you put into this life was simply the condition of the life rather than a decision you were making continuously." He looked at her. "And I understood that I had not been making the same decision. I had been assuming the life would continue regardless of what I did with the space inside it." She looked at him for a long time. "That is the most accurate thing you have said to me in 4 months," she said. He nodded once. He did not argue with the 4 months. "I am going to tell you what I need," she said, "not what I need you to promise. Promises are easy, and I am not interested in them right now. What I need is for you to understand that I am not going to make it easy for you to forget the weight of this by accepting an apology that lets us both move past it without doing the actual work of what past it requires." He was quiet. "I am also not going to make it impossible," she said. "I do not want it to be impossible. But impossible and easy are not the only two options." He looked at her with the expression she recognized from the beginning of things, from the southern summit beside the window, when he had asked a real question instead of a social one, and she had answered it, and something between them had clarified. "Tell me what the work looks like," he said. As she told him, it was, she recognized, the most honest conversation they had had in at least 2 years. She was not certain whether that said more about the conversation or about the 2 years that had preceded it. When he left that afternoon, she stood at Kira's kitchen window and watched his carriage move along the street below and thought about what he had said about the difference between the abstract understanding and the complete understanding of what he had risked. She thought he was right that there was a difference. She also thought that she would need to see the complete version hold for some time before she was willing to stake anything on it. She went back to the Ardenmere watershed. The water rights analysis was completed on the 8th day. It was one of the more thorough pieces of work she had produced in 2 years, and she felt, reading it over for the final time before sending it to her office, a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with the situation she was navigating and everything to do with the work itself, which had always given her that particular clean satisfaction that came from a complex problem resolved correctly. She sent it with a note requesting her supervisor forward it directly to the council subcommittee, without her name on the cover sheet, citing confidentiality considerations in the current political climate. The real reason was that she did not want the analysis's reception to be shaped by whatever the palace was currently saying or not saying about her absence. The work should stand alone. It did. She heard through Kira's network of professional contacts that the council subcommittee had described it as the clearest framework for historical precedent reconciliation they had received in a decade. She allowed herself approximately 45 seconds of satisfaction about this before moving on to the question of what she intended to say when she returned to the palace. She returned on a Tuesday. The return was described earlier, and what followed it accurately. What was not described was the moment, 3 days after she returned, when she went back to the mantelpiece in the bedchamber and stood for a moment looking at the portrait of Myra in the blue dress, which was exactly where she had left it before leaving, and understood that the 6 inches she had moved it back were still holding, and that this was a small thing, and that small things, accumulated over time, were what large things were made of. She thought about this for a while. Then she went to find her daughter, who was in the East Garden with a very specific theory about the behavior of beetles that she had been refining for 3 days, and which required Lena's full attention to properly evaluate. Lena gave it her full attention. The beetle theory was, on its own terms, genuinely compelling. In the months that followed, the marriage rebuilt itself in the way real things rebuild, slowly, with visible seams rather than pretending the break had not occurred. Aldrich attended Myra's bath time with a consistency he had not managed since Myra was an infant. He asked Lena, twice a week how the work was going and listened to the answers the way he had listened in the beginning, with actual attention rather than waiting for her to finish. He told his secretary that joint engagements required Lena's direct confirmation, not the calendar approval of an aide, which was a small procedural change that meant something larger than the procedure. She asked him, one evening in the sitting room in the second month, whether he missed it. He looked at her. The part that felt separate, she said, the thing that seemed like a different life for a little while. He thought about it seriously, which she had asked for by asking the question without a safe answer attached. No, he said, what I miss is the version of myself that didn't have to look at what it cost. That version was more comfortable, but it wasn't real. She nodded. She thought he was right. The comfortable version of a person was rarely the real one. She had been building the real version of herself, quietly and without announcing it, for the entire 12 days at Kiera's kitchen table, and she was not finished building it, and she thought that was correct. Real things were not finished. They continued. Myra, for now, received the information that her parents were in a period of rebuilding in the way 4-year-olds receive most complex information, by deciding it had something to do with the east garden wall and requesting to be involved. She was involved. The garden wall was repaired. The beetles Myra had been observing returned, and she reported this with the satisfaction of someone whose scientific predictions have been borne out. Lena attended the rescheduled charity presentation 6 weeks after returning. She stood at the lectern in the banquet hall where she had organized the first iteration of the program 2 years prior, when Myra was 14 months old, and Lena had returned to professional work partly from genuine need and partly from the specific stubbornness of someone who refuses to become only what circumstance has recently made them. The hall was full. She had spent 3 years building the program's reach, quietly, through the particular combination of competence and persistent follow-through that was her characteristic working method, and the room's fullness reflected that work accurately. Aldrich attended. He sat in the audience rather than on the dais, which was a change from previous years when his presence beside her at the lectern had been a matter of protocol. She had mentioned, before leaving for the hall, that she would prefer to stand there on her own this year. He had said, without argument, that he understood. He had arrived early and found a seat in the 3rd row, and she had seen him there from the side entrance before the program began, sitting with his jacket on and his hands folded, and his attention on the program materials in the way she recognized from the Eastern Summit 14 years ago, when he had stayed after the presentation to ask a real question. She gave the presentation well. She always gave presentations well. She acknowledged the program's contributors, updated the council on the year's outcomes, and proposed the following year's expansion with the specificity and evidence that her analysis background made automatic. When she finished, the room's response was what it had been the previous 2 years, warm and genuine, a recognition of work that had been consistently delivered. Afterward, in the corridor outside the hall, one of the council members who had attended told her the expansion proposal was the most clearly evidenced request for territorial resources he had seen in his decade on the council. She thanked him. She meant it. He had no idea what the past 6 weeks had contained, and this was correct, and the work's quality had nothing to do with any of it, and this was also correct. Aldrich found her near the entrance after the other attendees had left. "You didn't tell me it had grown that much," he said. She looked at him. "You didn't ask." He took this without flinching. "You're right. He looked at the doors to the banquet hall. From now on, I'm asking. She considered this. It was a small thing. It was also the kind of small thing that, accumulated over time, was what large things were made of. Good, she said. They walked to the carriage together. The night was cold and clear. Above the Capitol, the first winter stars were appearing at the edges of a deep blue sky, the specific color it went in the hour after sunset before it darkened fully, which Lena had always thought was one of the more precise and fleeting colors available in an ordinary day. She was involved. The garden wall was repaired. The beetles Myra had been observing returned, and she reported this with the satisfaction of someone whose scientific predictions have been borne out. Lena sat in the garden and watched her daughter crouch over the old stones and thought that she had been right 12 days ago at Kira's kitchen table in her assessment of what was worth the work. She still thought so. The work was considerable. The thing being rebuilt was real. Those two facts were, she had learned, the only pair that mattered. If you are still here, thank you for staying. What Lena carried through all of it was not a simple thing. It was not pure forgiveness or pure rage or pure resolve. It was something quieter and harder. The decision to remain a whole person while deciding whether to remain in the same life. You cannot control who chooses to betray the thing you have built together. You can control what standard you hold for what comes after. If Lena's choice spoke to you, leave one word in the comments. Real. And if this story stayed with you, a like, a share, or a subscription helps us keep bringing more of them here. There are more wolves learning expensive lessons about the things they very nearly destroyed. And more women deciding, in kitchens and gardens and quiet sitting rooms, exactly what they are worth.